There is a terrifying difference between being alone and being watched. On a rainy night in 1982, Kelly Berg Dove made 3 frantic calls for help. She followed every protocol. But when the police arrived just 2 minutes after her last scream, the only witness left was a telephone receiver dangling by its cord. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, we explore true crime cases by combining storytelling with expert analysis and AI reconstruction to put you right inside the investigation. Today, we are looking at the case of the open line. It is a timeline of terror, a critical look at a system failure, and a mystery that still haunts Virginia to this day. Let's get into it. Cruiser cut through the heavy humid air of Harrisonburg, Virginia, its tires hissing against the wet asphalt of South Main Street. It was 2:35 in the morning, a time when the world usually falls into a deep, rhythmic silence. But tonight the air was charged with a static tension that Officer Hatchell could feel even before he arrived at the scene. The Imperial Oil gas station emerged from the darkness like a beacon, its fluorescent lights humming with an aggressive brightness that carved out a small island of visibility in the middle of the pitch-black night. To a passing driver, everything might have looked normal, just a lonely service station waiting for customers who would never come, but the dispatch call that had broken the radio silence moments ago suggested that the normalcy here was nothing but a fragile illusion. Officer Hatchell pulled the vehicle into the forecourt, the red and blue emergency lights washing over the white brick walls of the small kiosk, creating dancing shadows that seemed to hide in the corners. He killed the engine, and for a split second, he sat there, gripping the steering wheel, listening to the rain tap rhythmically against the windshield. There was no movement inside the glass booth, no clerk waving him down, no frantic figure running toward safety. There was just the station, glowing and silent, standing like a stage set for a play where the actors had suddenly walked off in the middle of a scene. The sense of dread wasn't immediate. It was a slow creep, a realization that the stillness of the location was far more terrifying than chaos would have been. He stepped out of the cruiser, his boots crunching on the wet gravel, the cool night air hitting his face with the smell of ozone and gasoline. As he approached the glass structure, he instinctively placed a hand near his holster, his eyes scanning the perimeter for any sign of a vehicle, a struggle, or a suspect fleeing into the nearby woods. But the lot was empty. The pumps stood like silent sentinels, their nozzles holstered, waiting for cars that weren't there. The open sign was still illuminated in the window, casting a warm, inviting glow that felt sickeningly ironic given the circumstances. The door to the kiosk was unlocked, slightly ajar, as if someone had just stepped out for a breath of fresh air and intended to return in seconds. Pushing the door open, the officer was greeted not by a person, but by the overwhelming, heavy silence of a room that should have been occupied. The air inside was cool, conditioned, and smelled faintly of coffee and floor cleaner. His eyes immediately swept the small space. It was no more than a few square feet, a fishbowl designed for visibility. Everything appeared to be frozen in time, a snapshot of a mundane work shift interrupted by something sudden and catastrophic. A cigarette was still resting in an ashtray, a long trail of ash indicating it had burned down on its own without being smoked. A paperback book lay open on the counter, face down, marking a page that would never be turned. These were the artifacts of a life in progress, interrupted mid-thought. And then his eyes landed on the most chilling detail of the entire scene, the object that would become the symbol of this tragedy: the telephone. It wasn't sitting in its cradle. The beige receiver was dangling off the edge of the counter, suspended by its coiled cord, swaying ever so slightly in the draft from the open door. It hung there like a pendulum counting down to zero, hovering just a few feet above the linoleum floor. It was a lifeline that had been severed, a connection that had been physically dropped. That phone was the only witness left in the room, the mechanical ear that had heard the final moments of terror, now swinging silently in the empty booth. Officer Hatchell moved closer, his footsteps echoing too loudly in the small space. He leaned in, almost afraid to touch the receiver, as if doing so would break the spell or confirm the reality he didn't want to accept. He could hear it before he even lifted it to his ear, the silence on the other end. Not a dial tone, but the dead air of a connection that was still open, or perhaps the void of a line that had been abandoned. That hanging phone screamed of panic. It told a story of someone who didn't have the luxury of time to hang up, someone who was ripped away from their only tether to safety with such speed that the laws of physics were the only thing left operating in the room. He looked behind the counter, half expecting, half dreading to find a body slumped on the floor, a victim of a robbery gone wrong. But there was no one. The floor was clean. No blood spatter on the walls, no overturned chairs, no shattered glass. The violent struggle, if there was one, had been terrifyingly efficient. He checked the cash register. It was closed. He keyed it open. The cash was all there. Every dollar, every cent. This realization sent a cold shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Robbers take money. They smash and grab. They leave a mess. But predators? Predators take people. And they leave everything else exactly where it was. The logic of the timeline began to form in the officer's mind, and it didn't make sense. The dispatch records showed that the call to scream had happened mere minutes ago. He had been on patrol nearby. The response time was incredibly fast, practically immediate by rural standards. 2 minutes, 120 seconds. That was the gap between the last frantic communication from Kellyburg Dove and the arrival of law enforcement. How does a grown woman, fully conscious and fighting for her life, vanish from a lit room in the time it takes to brew a cup of coffee? It seemed physically impossible, a magic trick performed by a monster. He stepped back out into the night, the rain now falling harder, blurring the edges of the forest that surrounded the station. He looked into that darkness, realizing that whoever did this couldn't be far. They had to be close. Maybe they were still watching from the tree line, observing the blue lights, satisfied with their work. The proximity was suffocating. The idea that the perpetrator had managed to subdue a woman, get her into a vehicle, and speed away without leaving a tire mark or a single witness in such a short window of time spoke of calculation. It spoke of rehearsal. This wasn't a crime of chaotic opportunity. It felt like a surgical extraction. The radio on his shoulder crackled to life, the dispatcher asking for a status report. For a moment, Hatchell struggled with how to answer. What is the code for a room that is perfectly intact but completely wrong? How do you report a void? He pressed the button, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of the situation. Dispatch, arrival at scene. The location is secure, but the clerk is gone. No sign of robbery. The phone is off the hook. As he spoke those words, the reality solidified. This wasn't a theft. This was an abduction. And every second that ticked by on his watch was a mile of distance being put between Kelly and the only people who could help her. The fragility of safety is a concept we rarely think about until it is shattered. We assume that bright lights, locked doors, and telephone lines are shields that protect us from the darkness. But standing there in that empty gas station, it became horrifyingly clear that these things are just props. The glass booth wasn't a fortress. It was a display case. The lights didn't repel the predator. They highlighted the prey. Kellyburg Dove had been working inside a fishbowl, visible to anyone with dark intentions passing by on the highway, while she herself was blinded by the reflections in the glass, unable to see the danger stalking her from the shadows. As the forensic team was called in and more units began to arrive, turning the silent station into a hive of activity, the mystery deepened. They would dust for fingerprints. They would measure tire tracks. They would scour the area for clues. But the most important evidence was already gone. The story of what happened in those missing 2 minutes had vanished along with Kelly. To understand how we got to this empty room, with the swinging phone, we have to wind back the clock. We have to leave the silence of the aftermath and step back into the noise of the living. We need to meet the woman who stood here just hours ago, unaware that her shift would end in a mystery that would haunt this town for decades. To understand the tragedy of that night, we must first understand the person who was lost. Kelly Berg Dove was 20 years old, an age that sits on the delicate threshold between adolescence and true adulthood. She was a mother to a 4-year-old daughter, a responsibility that defined her every move and decision. She wasn't a risk-taker or a thrill-seeker. She was a young woman trying to build a stable life in the Shenandoah Valley. She had a soft face framed by feathered hair, typical of the early 80s, and a smile that friends described as shy but genuine. On the night of June 18, 1982, she wasn't thinking about becoming the center of a criminal investigation. She was likely thinking about her daughter, her bills, and the simple relief of clocking out. Harrisonburg, Virginia, in 1982, was the picture of American tranquility. It was a place of rolling hills, church steeples, and neighbors who knew each other by name. It was a community where the concept of stranger danger felt like a distant paranoia from the big cities, not a reality for a quiet college town. This false sense of security is often the first accomplice in crimes like this. When you live in a place where violence is rare, your guard is naturally lowered. You assume that the worst thing that can happen at a gas station is a rude customer or a short-changed register. Kelly walked into her shift that evening wrapped in the invisible, fragile blanket of small-town safety. But the location of the Imperial Oil Station told a different story. Situated on South Main Street, it wasn't in the bustling heart of town, but rather on the fringe, where the commercial zone began to bleed into the darkness of the countryside. It was an island of commerce surrounded by shadows. During the day, it was just a gas station. But at night, the architecture turned against whoever was inside. The kiosk was small, made almost entirely of glass windows on 3 sides. It was designed for maximum visibility so the clerk could see the pumps. However, when the sun went down, that design flaw became a fatal trap. There is a psychological and optical phenomenon to night shift workers as the fishbowl effect. When you are inside a brightly lit room at night, and the world outside is pitch black, physics plays a cruel trick on your senses. The windows, which are transparent during the day, transform into mirrors. If Kelly looked out, she wouldn't see the parking lot or the trees. She would see only the reflection of the fluorescent lights, the candy racks, and her own face staring back at her. She was effectively blind to the outside world, trapped in a box of light. Conversely, for anyone standing in the darkness outside, the dynamic was reversed. To a predator lurking in the parking lot or sitting in an idling car across the street, Kelly was on display in high definition. They could see where she stood, what she was reading, when she looked down, and when she was distracted. They could study her movements like a scientist studying an insect in a jar. The power dynamic was completely lopsided. The observer possessed total knowledge of the environment, while the observed was completely exposed yet totally blind. The shift itself started mundanly. It was the graveyard shift, a lonely stretch of time reserved for truckers, insomniacs, and late-night travelers. Kelly's duties were simple: activate the pumps, take the cash, stock the shelves. It was a job that required presence, not intense focus, which leaves the mind free to wander. One can imagine the quiet boredom of those early hours, the hum of the refrigerator motors, the smell of floor wax and stale coffee, the rustle of a magazine page. These sounds were the soundtrack of her isolation. She was the sole guardian of this small outpost, a singular point of life in a sleeping city. It is important to note that Kelly was not careless. She was known to be responsible, but the protocols of 1982 were not the protocols of today. There were no bulletproof glass partitions, no pass-through trays for cash, and no panic buttons linked directly to a private security firm. The door was a standard glass door. The lock was a simple latch. Her only weapon was a telephone landline behind the counter. She was guarding cash and inventory with nothing but her presence. A soft target in every sense of the security terminology. As the night deepened and the traffic on Route 11 thinned out to almost nothing, the isolation would have become physical. The rain that had begun to fall added another layer to the wall between her and the world. Rain blurs vision and muffles sound. If a car approached slowly, tires rolling over wet pavement, the sound would be masked by the rhythm of the downpour. The weather was conspiring to shrink her world down to the four walls of the kiosk. The psychological weight of being the only person awake while the rest of the town sleeps is heavy. It creates a vulnerability that goes beyond the physical. We often talk about victimology in cold cases, the study of why a specific person was targeted. In Kelly's case, her victimology was entirely situational. She wasn't targeted because of a personal vendetta or a high-risk lifestyle. She was targeted because she was there. She was a woman alone in a lit box on a dark road. This is what makes her story so universally terrifying. It implies that the only prerequisite for becoming a victim is being in the wrong place, doing your job while a predator is hunting for an opportunity. The hours ticked by. Midnight passed. Then 1 a.m. Then 2 a.m., the time when the bars close and the unpredictable element of society spills out onto the roads. Kelly likely felt the fatigue setting in, counting the hours until sunrise when the world would wake up and she could go home to her child. She had no way of knowing that her timeline had already been intersected by someone else's. Somewhere out in the dark, beyond the reach of the station's lights, eyes were watching the fishbowl. The transition from safety to danger is rarely instantaneous. It is usually a slide. It starts with a feeling, a prickle on the back of the neck. As we move toward the events that started at 2:27 a.m., we have to put ourselves in that booth. We have to feel the exposure. Imagine standing there, illuminated like a mannequin in a shop window, unable to see who is watching you from the dark theater of the parking lot. The stage was set, the lights were on, and the audience of one was about to make his presence known. Kelly Berg Dove was a mother, a daughter, and a hard worker. But in the eyes of the man watching from the shadows, she was simply prey in a cage of light. The normalcy of her night was about to be shattered by the chime of the door sensor, signaling the arrival of a nightmare that would not end when the sun came up. The fishbowl was about to be breached. Chapter 3. The first signal, 2:27 a.m. At exactly 2:27 in the morning, the monotonous hum of the gas station was shattered by the harsh electronic chime of the door sensor. In the daylight, that sound is a welcome notification of commerce. In the dead of night, it sounds like a perimeter breach. Kelly was alone behind the counter when a silver Ford rolled onto the lot. It didn't pull up to the pumps with the decisive movement of a traveler needing fuel. Instead, it parked in the shadows, slightly away from the direct glare of the canopy lights. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. The atmosphere inside the kiosk shifted instantly. The air pressure seemed to drop, and Kelly, who had been fighting the late-night fatigue, was suddenly jolted into a state of high alert. The man who walked through that door did not behave like a typical 2 a.m. customer. Usually, late-night patrons are transactional and swift. They want gas, caffeine, or cigarettes, and they want to get back on the road. Their eyes focus on the products or the register. But this man's focus was different. He didn't look at the shelves. He looked at the environment. He looked at the layout. And most terrifyingly, he looked at her. He approached the counter not to buy, but to ask for directions. In the world of criminal psychology, this is often a ruse, a pretext to close the distance, hear the victim's voice, and assess who else might be in the back room. Then there was his appearance. In the police log that would be filed later, Kelly's description of the man contained a chillingly vague but specific detail. She said he was dressed improperly. The records don't specify exactly what that meant, whether he was partially undressed, wearing clothes that didn't match the weather, or something even more disturbing. However, the human brain is hardwired to recognize patterns, and when a pattern is broken, our survival instincts flare up. When we see someone whose appearance violates social norms, our primitive brain interprets it as a sign of unpredictability. If he cannot follow the basic rules of dressing, what other rules is he willing to break? Kelly's reaction was immediate and visceral. She didn't dismiss him as just a weirdo. She felt threatened enough to pick up the phone the moment he stepped back outside. However, she didn't dial 911. She dialed the local police department's administrative line. This is a tragic and common reaction among victims, especially women. We are socialized not to make a scene or be hysterical. We doubt our own terror. She likely reasoned that since he hadn't shown a weapon or verbally threatened her yet, it wasn't a true emergency. She was trying to be rational in an irrational situation, asking for a patrol car to just drive by rather than screaming for help. This moment is what security expert Gavin DeBecker calls the gift of fear. It is the idea that true fear is not an emotion, but a signal. It is a high-speed logical process performed by the unconscious mind. Kelly's conscious mind might have been thinking, he's just a creepy guy asking for directions. But her limbic system, the lizard brain responsible for survival, was screaming, predator. Her amygdala detected micro-expressions, subtle aggressive body language, and the predatory stare that her conscious mind hadn't yet processed into words. The fact that she called the police at all proves that her biological siren was blaring. The man returned to his car, but he didn't leave. This is the moment the dynamic shifted from an uncomfortable encounter to a siege. A normal person who asks for directions gets in their car and drives away in the direction indicated, but the silver Ford sat there. He wasn't looking at a map. He was looking at the kiosk. Kelly was now trapped in that fishbowl we discussed, forced to pretend she was working while every nerve ending in her body was tracking the silhouette in the parking lot. The window glass, once a barrier against the rain, now felt like the only thing separating her from a monster. During that first call, the police dispatcher took her report, but according to procedure at the time, didn't categorize it as a code 0 or immediate threat. It was a suspicious person report. In 1982, without the keyword gun or attack, the urgency was filtered out by the bureaucracy of the protocol. The dispatcher told her they would send someone over when they could. To the police, it was a low priority check. To Kelly, it was a lifeline being tossed too slowly. She hung up the phone, likely feeling a mix of relief that she had reported it and annoying anxiety that help wasn't coming fast enough. We must pause to consider the bravery it took for her to remain at her post. Many people ask, why didn't she just run? But run where? Into the dark woods surrounding the station? Into the rain? Her car was likely parked in the back or near his. Abandoning the store was a fireable offense, and leaving the safety of the locked building to run into the open night is a counterintuitive move when you feel hunted. Her safest bet, logically, was to stay inside the locked lit room and wait for the authorities. She was following the rules of civilization. The predator outside was following the rules of the wild. The dressed improperly detail haunts this case because it suggests a sexual or deviant motivation from the very start. It wasn't a robbery. Robbers want to blend in. They wear hoodies, hats, dark clothes. Someone who draws attention to themselves by dressing strangely is not there for the money. They are there for a reaction. They are feeding off the shock or the fear of the observer. He wanted her to see him. He wanted her to be confused and disturbed. This was the psychological opening move of a game she didn't know she was playing. As the minutes ticked by 2:28, 2:29, the tension inside that kiosk must have been suffocating. Every time the wind rattled the glass, her heart likely skipped a beat. She was watching the silver Ford, and the driver of the Ford was watching her. It was a standoff. He was waiting for something. Perhaps he was waiting for the lot to be completely empty of passing cars. Perhaps he was waiting to see if she had called for help. Or perhaps he was just savoring the control he now held over her, enjoying the terror he could inflict without even lifting a finger. This initial contact was the interview. In criminology, an interview isn't just a conversation, it's a test. By entering the store and speaking to her, he was testing her defenses. Was she alone? Was she confident? Was she submissive? Did she have a weapon? The fact that he didn't attack immediately suggests he was a calculated offender, not an impulsive one. He assessed the risks and decided the odds were in his favor. He walked out to his car not to leave, but to prepare for the second phase of his assault. The first signal had been sent. The biological alarm had been rung. Kelly Berg Dove had done exactly what she was supposed to do. She trusted her gut and she called the law. But as the receiver clicked back into the cradle, the silence returned to the station, a heavy, pregnant silence that would not last for long. The silver Ford was still there, and the man inside was done asking for directions. He was getting ready to come back. Here, the man walked out of the glass door, the bell chiming its false cheerful goodbye, but the relief Kelly felt was extinguished in less than a heartbeat. He didn't get back into his car to leave. He got in, closed the door, and the engine remained silent. The silver Ford sat there in the parking lot, bathed in the mix of rain and neon light, transformed from a vehicle into a stationary weapon. It was close enough that she could see the silhouette of his head against the headrest, but far enough into the shadows that his features were erased. He was just a dark shape in a steel box, and that shape was facing her. The car didn't move. The brake lights didn't flare. He was simply parked, loitering in the gray area between customer and threat. Inside the kiosk, the silence returned, but now it had teeth. The atmosphere had thickened, turning the air inside the small room into something heavy and suffocating. Kelly likely stood frozen behind the counter, her hands gripping the cold edge of the laminate, knuckles turning white. This is the part of fear that movies often skip: the paralysis of the wait. It's not the scream. It's the breath you hold before it. Her mind was likely racing through a frantic checklist of rationality, trying to bargain with her instincts. Maybe he's just checking a map. Maybe he's waiting for the rain to let up. Maybe he's counting change. But the lizard brain knows better. It knows that normal people don't stare at gas station clerks in the middle of the night. The glass walls of the station, which hours ago felt like a protective barrier against the elements, now felt dangerously thin. A sheet of glass is a strange thing. It is solid enough to keep out the wind, but fragile enough to shatter with a single stone. To Kelly, looking out into the wet night, that glass must have felt like a soap bubble. She was on display, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent tubes overhead. Every move she made, shifting her weight, glancing at the clock, brushing her hair from her face, was a performance for an audience of one. She was the star of a terrified reality show, and he was the director, watching from the front row. Outside on the main road, life continued with a cruel indifference. Every now and then, a car would swoosh by on the wet highway, tires singing on the asphalt, headlights cutting a temporary path through the gloom. To those drivers, the gas station was just a blur of light in their peripheral vision. They had no idea that inside that glowing box, a woman was hyperventilating, praying for one of them to turn in. That is the isolation of the night shift. You are visible to the world, yet completely unreachable. It is the ships in the night phenomenon played out in a horror scenario. Help was passing by at 50 miles per hour, separated by a pane of glass and a few yards of concrete. The soundscape of the room likely magnified her anxiety. Without the distraction of customers or radio, the hum of the refrigeration units would have sounded like a roar. The rhythmic dripping of rain from the roof overhang, the ticking of the wall clock, the settling of the building's foundation, every noise was a potential footstep. When you are hunted, your senses dial up to maximum sensitivity. The sound of the wind rattling the door frame mimics the sound of a hand testing the handle. Kelly was trapped in an acoustic feedback loop of her own fear, listening to the silence for the sound of danger approaching. We can imagine the internal monologue of a mother in this situation. The fear of death is potent, but the fear of leaving a child behind is a different kind of agony. It adds a layer of desperation to the survival instinct. She wasn't just protecting herself. She was protecting her daughter's future. This thought process changes the chemistry of the brain. It moves a person from freeze to flight or fight, but she couldn't fly. Her car was likely behind the building or near his. To leave, she would have to walk past him. To lock herself in the back room, if there was one, would mean trapping herself with no exit. The counter was her only fortress. The man in the car continued to wait. This behavior, the lingering, is a form of psychological terrorism. In the animal kingdom, a predator often stalks its prey, letting the fear exhaust the victim before the strike. By sitting there, he was establishing dominance. He was saying, "I have nowhere to be. I have all the time in the world. Do you?" He was letting the tension build, knowing that fear makes people irrational, makes them clumsy, makes them freeze. He was marinating her in terror, watching her pace, watching her pick up the phone and put it down, savoring the control he exerted from 20 feet away. Kelly's eyes probably kept darting to the phone. The administrative line had been called. The police said they would send someone, but minutes in a crisis don't move like minutes on a clock. Einstein's theory of relativity applies perfectly to trauma. Time dilates. A minute of waiting for a killer to move feels like an hour. A minute of waiting for a police siren feels like a lifetime. She checked her watch. 2:28, 2:29. It had only been a moment, but it felt like the world had stopped turning. Why weren't they here? How far away was the patrol car? The uncertainty is a torture all its own. As she watched him, she might have tried to memorize details just in case. The license plate was likely obscured by mud or darkness. The make of the car. The shape of his head. But the rain blurred everything. The water streaming down the shop windows acted like a distortion lens, turning the world outside into an impressionist painting of gray and black. He was a ghost in a machine. This visual ambiguity adds to the horror. If you can see the threat clearly, you can plan. If the threat is a shadow, your imagination fills in the blanks with your worst nightmares. The psychological toll of being encornered in an open space is profound. Usually, being cornered implies being in a dead-end alley. But here, she was cornered by light. She couldn't step out into the darkness because that was his domain. She couldn't turn off the lights because then she wouldn't see him coming. She was pinned down by the very electricity that was supposed to keep her safe. It's a paradox that destabilizes the mind. The sanctuary has become the trap. The light is no longer a comfort. It is a target marker. Then, movement. A shift in the shadows. Was he opening the car door? Was he reaching for something? The adrenaline spike would have been painful, a sharp jolt to the chest. This is the moment where the mind bargains. Please just drive away. Please let this be a misunderstanding. But the silver Ford didn't reverse. It didn't leave. The predator had finished his assessment. The waiting period was over. The psychological siege was about to transition into a physical confrontation. Kelly realized that the administrative call wasn't enough. The casual promise of a drive-by check was insufficient for the monster sitting outside. The fear had graduated from unease to terror. She needed to escalate. She needed to scream. With shaking hands, she reached for the receiver again. It was 2:29 a.m. The silence was about to be broken for the second time, but this time, the voice on the line wouldn't be calm. It would be the voice of a woman who... 2 minutes. That is all the time that passed between the first call and the second. In the world of emergency response, a callback within 2 minutes signals a rapid deterioration of safety. At 2:29 a.m., Kelly Bergdove picked up the receiver again. The man had not left. In fact, he had escalated. He wasn't just loitering in the dark anymore. He had come back to the window, or perhaps back inside the store. The dress issue was mentioned again. He was harassing her. This wasn't a customer. This was an aggressor testing the boundaries of the facility and the woman inside it. Kelly's voice, likely trembling but determined, relayed the urgency. He was back, he was acting strangely, and she was scared. However, On the other end of the line, the machinery of 1982 law enforcement was grinding at its own slow, methodical pace. To the dispatcher sitting in a warm, safe radio room, the call was classified not as a code zero, an officer in trouble or immediate life threat, but as a suspicious person or a disorderly conduct complaint. This classification is not just a matter of semantics, it is a matter of survival. In police dispatching, calls are triaged. A bank robbery in progress is priority 1. A shooting is priority 1. A weird guy at a gas station usually falls to priority 2 or 3. It sits in the queue, waiting for a unit to clear from a traffic stop or a coffee break. We must look at this through the lens of the era. Today, a lone woman working the night shift reporting a man with improper dress harassing her would likely trigger an immediate high-priority response due to enhanced awareness of sexual predation and stalking laws. But 30 years ago, the cultural and policing landscape was different. Without an explicit weapon scene or a direct threat of death verbalized, the system defaulted to a lower gear. The dispatcher likely viewed it as a nuisance call, a drunk wandering in from a bar, or a local creep getting a thrill. They promised to send someone shortly. That word shortly is one of the most dangerous words in the English language when seconds count. This is where the system failure occurs. It is a failure of imagination. The protocol required a crime to be in progress to justify a lights and sirens response. But harassment is the crime in progress. It is the precursor to assault. By waiting for the man to actually attack before upgrading the call, the system essentially demanded that Kelly become a victim before she could be treated as a priority. She was asking for prevention, but the police were set up only for reaction. This gap, the time between the red flag and the bloody act, is where victims fall through the cracks. Technically, we call this bureaucratic inertia. The police department was operating on a set of rigid rules that did not account for the nuance of human intuition. Kelly knew she was in danger. Her biological alarm was deafening, but she had to translate that visceral terror into a calm request for service to a stranger on a telephone. The dispatcher couldn't see the predator's eyes. They couldn't feel the tension in the air. They only had the words, "suspicious male." And those words did not carry enough weight to cut through the red tape of the night shift rotation. Meanwhile, the man outside, or perhaps standing right at the glass, was learning something terrifyingly empowering. No one is coming. Predators are observant. He likely saw her on the phone. He knew she was calling the authorities. In a functional deterrent system, the fear of police arrival drives the criminal away. But as the seconds ticked by and the night remained silent, no sirens wailing, no blue lights flashing, his confidence grew. The lack of immediate police presence validated his control. It told him that he had time. The system's delay became his accomplice. Kelly's frustration must have been agonizing. Imagine following every rule society taught you. You are at work. You are responsible. You call the police. You give a description. And yet, you are still alone. The phone line, her only connection to safety, was offering promises but no physical protection. She was likely told to sit tight or ignore him. Standard advice for a nuisance. Fatal advice for a predator. She hung up the phone at 2:29 a.m. with the assurance that help was on the way, but without any timeline. She was left holding a check that she couldn't cash. This moment highlights a critical flaw in how we used to view suspicious behavior. For decades, law enforcement treated creepy behavior as a non-crime. It was legal to be weird. It was legal to stare. It was legal to wear strange clothes. But forensic psychology tells us that these behaviors are rarely isolated quirks. They are often testing behaviors. The predator pushes a small boundary to see what happens. If the wall holds, they retreat. If the wall cracks or if the guardians of the wall don't show up, they smash through. The system failed to recognize that the man wasn't just being annoying. He was rehearsing an abduction. The technology gap is also a culprit. In 1982, there was no GPS tracking of patrol cars on a digital map. The dispatcher couldn't instantly see that Officer Hatchell was nearby. They had to rely on radio roll calls. Unit 3, what's your 20? Unit 3, copy. The communication was analog and slow. Information had to be verbally relayed, losing urgency and detail in the process. Today, a panic button or a 911 call from a cell phone often gives immediate location data and can be silently monitored. Kelly had none of this. She was relying on a chain of human communication that was only as strong as its weakest link. At 2:30 a.m., the station was still quiet. The rain was still falling. The prompt response Kelly hoped for had not materialized. To the police, only 2 minutes had passed since the first call, hardly a delay in their eyes. But for Kelly, trapped in the fishbowl, those minutes were an eternity of escalation. The man saw that his presence was not being challenged. The psychological barrier had been crossed. He had tested the water, and the water was still. The tragedy of the 2:29 a.m. call is that it was the last chance for prevention. It was the final off-ramp before the cliff. If a siren had blared in the distance right then, the silver Ford likely would have peeled out of the parking lot, and Kelly would have gone home to her daughter, shaken but alive. Instead, the radio waves carried a routine dispatch for a checkup, creating a vacuum of authority that the predator was all too eager to fill. As Kelly placed the receiver back on the hook for the second time, she must have felt the crushing weight of abandonment. The system worked on paper, but it was failing in practice. She was now facing a threat that had graduated from suspicious to imminent, and the only thing standing between her and the violence to come was a glass door with a simple latch. The time for administration was over. The time for horror was about to begin. It was 2:33 a.m. Only 4 minutes had passed since the nightmare began, but inside the kiosk, time had run out. The man in the silver Ford made his decision. He didn't walk casually this time. The hesitation was gone. The testing phase was over. He moved with the terrifying purpose of someone who has calculated the odds and knows that no one is coming to stop him. Inside the glass box, Kelly saw the shift in his body language. The predator was no longer lurking, he was charging. Kelly grabbed the phone for the third time. This was not a call for a checkup. This was a plea for life. Her fingers, likely trembling uncontrollably, fumbled with the dial. The primal fear had taken over completely. The logic of suspicious person had vanished, replaced by the raw, animalistic panic of immediate danger. She got the dispatcher on the line, but there was no time for pleasantries or detailed descriptions. The protocol had collapsed. "He's back," she said. Her voice was reportedly high, tight, laced with the kind of adrenaline that constricts the throat. But before the dispatcher could ask for clarification, before the radio could crackle with a response, the background sound of the call told the real story. The chime of the door sensor triggered again. Ding-dong. A sound she probably heard hundreds of times a shift. A sound of welcome now signaled the breach of her sanctuary. The glass wall had been penetrated. The man was inside. In that split second, the fishbowl became a cage. The tiny space behind the counter offered nowhere to run. There was no back exit, no panic room. She was cornered between the register and the wall, facing a man whose intentions had darkened with every minute of the delay. We don't know exactly what he looked like in that moment, whether he was smiling or blank or angry, but we know what Kelly saw. She saw her end approaching. Then, the scream. It wasn't a scream of surprise. It was a scream of realization. "He's in," she cried out. Or perhaps just a wordless shriek of terror. The transcripts are clinical, but the reality was chaotic. It was the sound of a mother realizing she might never see her child again. It was the sound of total, absolute vulnerability. And then, abruptly, the screaming stopped. Not because she was safe, but because she was silenced. The phone didn't click off. This is the detail that makes this case the stuff of nightmares. Usually, in a struggle, the connection is lost. The line goes dead, but here, the receiver was dropped. It hit the counter, then perhaps swung down, bouncing against the wall, the coiled cord stretching to its limit. The connection remained live. The dispatcher, sitting miles away in a secure room, was forced to listen to the sounds of the struggle. The scuffling of shoes on linoleum, the heavy, ragged breathing, the muffled commands of the abductor. Violence, real violence, is often shockingly fast. It doesn't look like the movies with drawn-out fight scenes. It is sudden, overwhelming, and disorienting. Within seconds, the man had control. The dominance he had established psychologically from the parking lot was now physical. He didn't need to stay long. He didn't empty the register. He didn't take the cigarettes. He took her. The entire abduction likely took less than 20 seconds from the moment the door chimed. On the other end of the line, the dispatcher's voice called out into the void. "Kelly? Kelly? Are you there?" But the only response was the ambient noise of the empty store. The hum of the refrigerator, the rain drumming against the roof, the sound of a car door slamming shut outside, and then the sound of an engine revving and tires peeling away on wet pavement. The getaway. The receiver was left dangling, swaying like a metronome, counting the seconds of a timeline that had just been severed. The line was open, transmitting nothing but the sound of an empty room. That dead air is more terrifying than any scream. It signifies the complete erasure of a person. One moment she was there, fighting, pleading, existing. The next moment, she was gone, leaving only the mechanical hum of the station behind. The visuals of this moment are haunting in their stillness. The open sign was still lit. The coffee pot was still warm. The magazine was still open on the counter. The universe of the gas station had not changed, except for the subtraction of one human life. The environment was indifferent to the tragedy that had just occurred. The fluorescent lights didn't flicker. They just kept buzzing, illuminating a crime scene that was devoid of a body. The open line became a silent witness. It kept the channel to the police open, recording the absence of Kelly. It was a technological tragedy, a connection that existed but came too late to convey the information that mattered. The wire carried her voice, then her scream, and finally, the echo of her departure. It hung there, a plastic pendulum, swinging back and forth, slowing down with each arc, until it finally came to a rest, pointing straight down at the floor where she had stood just moments before. The silence that followed 2:33 a.m. was heavy. It was the silence of a failure, the silence of a predator slipping back into the dark woods of Virginia, taking his prize with him. The police were on their way now. Officer Hatchell was speeding down Main Street, sirens finally wailing, but the race was already lost. The 2-minute gap had closed. The timeline of terror had ended. When Officer Hatchell's cruiser finally skidded onto the wet gravel of the Imperial Oil Station, the sirens were cut, leaving only the rhythmic swish-swish of the windshield wipers and the strobe effect of the emergency lights bouncing off the rain. He was 2 minutes late. In the context of a shift, 2 minutes is a coffee break. In the context of an abduction, 2 minutes is the difference between an arrest and a cold case. The officer drew his weapon and approached the kiosk, his boots stepping into a scene that was hauntingly sterile. There was no gunman. There was no body. There was just the hum of the fluorescent lights and that damn telephone, still swaying on its cord like a pendulum counting down to a zero that had already passed. The first rule of crime scene investigation is that the environment tells a story. Every object, every displacement, is a sentence and a narrative. As Hatchell and the backup unit secured the perimeter, the story the scene told was confusing because of what was missing. Usually, a violent crime is chaotic shattered glass, overturned racks, blood spatter. But the interior of the kiosk was undisturbed. The candy bars were in rows. The floor was clean. The lack of destruction pointed to something terrifying: control. Whoever took Kelly didn't have to fight the room. He only had to dominate the person. This wasn't a brawl. It was a surgical extraction. The most critical piece of forensic evidence was the cash register. It was closed. When investigators keyed it open, they found approximately $400 inside the nightstick. In 1982, that was a significant amount of money. If this were a robbery, the drawer would be open, the cash would be gone, and Kelly might have been left injured on the floor. The presence of the money changed the entire classification of the crime. Robbery is a crime of profit. Abduction is a crime of possession. The offender walked past a stack of easy cash to take a human being. This chilling fact immediately escalated the psychological profile of the suspect from a desperate thief to a sexually motivated predator. On the counter, the police found the artifacts of an interrupted life, frozen in time like a Pompeii exhibit. There was a magazine open to a page Kelly had been reading. There was a pack of cigarettes. There was her purse tucked away safely. These items speak to the element of surprise. Kelly didn't plan to leave. She didn't have time to grab her belongings. The items suggest that up until the very last second, she was trying to maintain normalcy. The juxtaposition of these mundane objects against the horror of the open phone line creates a dissonance that unsettled even the seasoned detectives. It emphasized that the violence was instantaneous. Forensic profiling, a field that was gaining traction in the early 80s thanks to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, would categorize this offender as organized. A disorganized offender strikes in a panic, leaves a mess, and often kills at the scene. An organized offender brings a vehicle, brings a weapon, or the threat of one, and controls the interaction. He had the presence of mind to park his car, wait for the right moment, enter the store, subdue Kelly without creating a visible struggle, and transport her away all within a window of roughly 120 seconds. This level of efficiency suggests it wasn't his first time fantasizing about this, even if it was his first time doing it. He had rehearsed this scenario in his mind. The blitz attack theory is supported by the lack of defensive wounds or overturned furniture. In a space that's small, if Kelly had fought back physically, shelves would have been knocked over. The fact that the store was pristine suggests that the offender used immediate, overwhelming intimidation. He likely produced a weapon, a knife, or a gun the moment he entered at 2:33 a.m. The psychological shock of a weapon freezes the victim. He relied on her compliance to get her out of the store quickly. He didn't want a fight. He wanted a captive. Outside the station, the rain was washing away potential evidence, but investigators found a cigarette butt in the parking lot near where the silver Ford had been idling. In 1982, this was just trash. Today, it would be a goldmine of DNA. Back then, it only served to confirm the timeline. Someone had stood there, smoking, watching, waiting. It was a physical testament to the hunting phase. He didn't just drive by and grab her. He had invested time in the stalk. This patience is a hallmark of a predator who derives pleasure not just from the act, but from the anticipation. The location of the crime also provided a geographical profile. The Imperial Oil Station was on the edge of town. To escape quickly without running into the responding police cars who were coming from the main station, the driver likely knew the back roads. He didn't speed down the main highway where he would be seen. He vanished into the dark, rural veins of Virginia. This suggests a local offender, someone familiar with the traffic patterns, the shift changes, and the blind spots of Harrisonburg. He was a wolf who knew the forest. The absence of the victim is the most difficult hurdle in a forensic investigation. In a murder, the body tells you how they died. In a robbery, the witnesses tell you what happened. In a disappearance, you are investigating a void. The police had the recording of the call, the scream, the silence, but they had no physical description other than silver car. They were chasing a ghost. The silence on the other end of the line was matched only by the silence of the clues left behind. As the forensic photographers flashed their bulbs, illuminating the lonely gas station in stark bursts of white light, the gravity of the system failure became undeniable. The police were standing in a crime scene that shouldn't have existed. If the priority call had been upgraded at 2:29 a.m., Hatchell might have pulled into the lot while the silver Ford was still there. The evidence of the coffee, the magazine, and the money wasn't just clues. They were accusations. They were proof that Kelly was doing her job while the safety net beneath her was unraveling. The psychological profile of the killer that emerged that night was terrifying. He was bold enough to strike under lights, calm enough to ignore the money, and cruel enough to take a mother away from her child. He was an opportunistic hunter. He didn't know Kelly personally, likely. But he saw the fishbowl, saw the isolation, and decided to act. He was a man who felt entitled to take a life simply because the opportunity presented itself. As the sun began to rise over Harrisonburg, the open sign was finally turned off. The yellow crime scene tape was wrapped around the pumps. The physical evidence had been bagged and tagged. But the most important thing, the woman who had dialed the phone was nowhere to be found. The police had the cigarettes, the money, and the mystery. The killer had everything else. The forensic story ended at the door. The rest of the story was now hidden in the darkness where the silver Ford had gone. Chapter 8. The sun rose over Harrisonburg on June 19, 1982, but it brought no light to the mystery of the Imperial Oil Station. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks stretched into decades. The police launched massive searches, scouring the Shenandoah Valley, dragging riverbeds, and combing through the dense forests that border the highways. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through tall grass, hoping to find a clue, a piece of clothing, or Kelly herself. But the earth refused to give up its secret. The disappearance was total. It was as if the silver Ford had driven off the edge of the world. Over the years, the file on Kelly Berg Dove grew thick with tips, sightings, and theories, but thin on concrete evidence. Investigators looked at everyone. They looked at local men with histories of violence. They looked at serial killers known to operate in Virginia along the Route 11 corridor. Composite sketches were drawn generic faces of men with dark hair and hollow eyes and plastered on telephone poles and shop windows. But a sketch is not a name, and a suspicion is not a conviction. Several persons of interest were interrogated, men who fit the profile of an anger retaliatory predator, but without a body or DNA technology, which was non-existent in 1982, the district attorney could never build a case strong enough to go to trial. The tragedy of a cold case is a specific kind of torture for the family left behind. In a murder case where a body is found, there is a funeral, there is a grave to visit, there is a definitive end. But in a disappearance, the grief is suspended in amber. Kelly's family, her sister, and her young daughter were forced to live in the cruel purgatory of the unknown. Every time the phone rang, every time a car pulled into the driveway slowly, hope would flare up, only to be extinguished again. They had to mourn a person who might still be out there, or mourn a ghost who was never laid to rest. The legacy of this case, however, extends beyond the grief of one family. It forced a hard look at the law enforcement protocols of the time. The failure to dispatch a car at 2:27 a.m. became a case study in police academies. It highlighted the dangerous gap between policy and reality. In the years following Kelly's abduction, and other similar cases in the 80s, the criteria for dispatching emergency services began to shift. The definition of an emergency was broadened to include the perception of danger, not just the visible presence of a weapon. Policies were rewritten to prioritize the safety of lone workers at night. As the narrator of this story, I must emphasize a hard truth. Safety regulations are often written in blood. It usually takes a tragedy of this magnitude to expose the flaws in the system. The system failure we analyzed in Chapter 5 was not malicious. It was bureaucratic. But bureaucracy doesn't comfort a grieving mother. The changes in protocol came too late for Kelly, but they have undoubtedly saved the lives of others. Today, a call reporting a stalker outside a lone woman's workplace is treated with the urgency it deserves, an urgency bought at a terrible price. The case remains open, but the open line that Kelly established with the police that night has never truly been closed. Somewhere someone knows what happened. Allegiances change, people get older, and guilt gets heavier. There is always a hope that a deathbed confession or a new DN, a match from that cigarette butt, could finally provide the answer. But until then, Kellyburg Dove remains a face on a missing person poster, frozen at 20 years old, a reminder of the fragility of safety. This story leaves us with a chilling lesson about the human instinct. Kellyburg Dove was right. From the moment that man walked in, she knew. Her logic might have tried to rationalize it, and the police dispatcher might have tried to minimize it, but her gut instinct was screaming the truth. We are often taught to be polite, to not make a scene, to not be paranoid, but nature gave us fear for a reason. It is a gift. If you ever feel the hair stand up on your neck, if you ever feel that a situation is wrong, listen to that voice. It is better to be rude and safe and polite and a victim. The image of the telephone receiver swinging on its cord is the haunting symbol of this case. It represents the call that was heard but not answered in time. It represents the thin wire that connects us to civilization and how easily that wire can be cut. Kelly did everything she was supposed to do. She fought for her life with the only weapon she had, her voice. As we conclude, we remember Kelly not just as a victim of a crime, but as a woman who stood her ground in the face of terror. We remember her for the fight she put up in those final seconds. And we keep telling her story so that the silence of that open line is filled with our demand for answers. For the family, for the truth, and for the hope that the dark woods will one day give up their secret, we do not forget. That brings us to the end of this timeline. This case is still technically unsolved, and police in Virginia are still accepting tips. If you have any theory on what happened that night, or if you think the police protocol of 1982 is to blame, let me know in the comments below. If you found this analysis compelling, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. We are building a community here that respects the victims and analyzes the facts. I'll see you in the next investigation. Stay safe, trust your gut, and watch the shadows.